We're not going to go from one extreme to the other. It is
Right.
appropriate to be triggered.
Right.
It's about what we do with that and how we manage that for ourselves that we're looking for. And the idea of turning to food is simply a maladaptive behavior that we've developed. We learned it. We can unlearn it. We can learn something new and replace it. And that's really effing exciting. Welcome to Salad with a Side of Fries. I'm your host, Jenn, talking wellness and weight loss for real life. We're here to clear up the myths, misinformation, bad science, and marketing to teach you how to eat and how to cheat. Are you ready? I'm having salad with a side of fries. Hey there, welcome back to another episode of Salad with a Side of Fries. I'm your host, Jenn Trepic. Joining me today is a dear friend, colleague, fitness trainer, Darlene Bellarmino.
Hi,
Darlene,
everybody.
hey, so you've been with us a couple times now.
Yeah.
First, you were a featured guest for an interview. We talked about fitness through the decades of life,
That's
right?
right. Yes.
And then you were back again. We talked with the willpower episode.
Right.
You joined me.
Exactly.
So that actually makes today sort of fitting. So that episode that we did was about willpower. Today, we're talking about triggers. So now
I'm
the title
excited.
makes sense. Yeah. But now the title makes sense to everybody because it's tick, tick, boom, right? This is all the tick, tick part. So before we get into it, I want to tell our members what they're getting this week. So you guys, your recipe, also appropriate for today's nutrition nugget, is a roasted vegetable bowl. It is super filling and delicious. It uses a spinach base, although you could really choose any greens. Then it has cilantro, lime, black beans, maple chili sweet potatoes, marinated mushrooms, a romesco sauce, and parmesan. It's actually like 5 recipes in one. It's honestly like beyond delicious. And fitting for today's episode, I am sending you 2 downloads. One is a feelings inventory, the other is a needs inventory. So that will all make sense as we go through. So if this sounds yummy and you want these downloads, join the membership. Go to glow.fm/salad with a side of fries. The membership is only $10 a month, for which you get weekly recipes, a monthly article or tool, extra discounts from me and our partners, plus access to live Q&A sessions. Also, a couple questions that were recently sent to us. So I want to let you guys know. The way this works is that everything is sent directly to your email inbox on Fridays. So the email comes from me. You don't have to worry about registering for anything or going to another site. As long as you have gone to Glow and completed the form there, you will get everything delivered to your inbox, usually on Fridays. I do my best to make it Friday mornings. And that's it. Super simple. Everything you get is worth far more than that $10 monthly cost. As I always say, show yourself that your health is a priority with this membership. Plus, by being a member, you're supporting this podcast and this community so we can continue bringing you new episodes and experts every single week. So one more time, go to glow.fm/salad with a side of fries, or just click the link in the show notes. Even easier. Once you're there, you click support now, enter your email and payment method, click subscribe, and you're all set. You'll get this week's 5-in-1 roasted vegetable bowl recipe and the feelings and needs inventories. All right. So I want to preface this whole conversation by saying these are not easy conversations. And this is likely an episode where it's not one of those where it's going to end and you're implementing a whole bunch of recommendations immediately. In fact, you may not listen to this all the way through the first time. You might have to listen to this a couple times. So the first time you listen, let it just plant seeds. And then check in with yourself later today or tomorrow and just see what's sticking with you. Then listen to it again to choose 1 or 2 tools to implement for whatever is sticking with you, right? Then you can come back and listen for a new tool or even a different way to address something that you were already working on because it is a bit of trial and error. Maybe the things that you opted for weren't the best fit, right? That's okay. But so that's the plan, right? So as we're going through this, if you're noticing your own stuff, right? If you're noticing your resistance or you feel like turning it off, that's okay. Pause it, come back. Just all I can say is do your best to listen and be open and more in like observation. Like notice what's coming up and let things sink in. Cool?
Love it.
All right. Darlene, when I told you we were talking about triggers, what was the first thing you thought of?
Therapy.
Right.
Triggers.
Which is funny because a client of mine yesterday told me I should be a therapist.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah, because that word is really used in that, but it's also used when we're talking about eating, which, eating has a lot to do with what's going on in our lives, has in the past. So I'm really excited to do this one with you just because of that. My background is mental health. So this
Yeah.
is very interesting and great for me.
Yeah. So I think so the way I think about it and the way I have a sort of my notes organized or how my brain organizes this is I have these sort of in divided into categories. Um One of the categories though is not hunger, right? Cuz
Right.
theoretically stomach hunger is a trigger to eat. We have a nutrition nugget on hunger that you can go back to. We talk about this one all the time. What I want to focus on today is all the other triggers, right? That maybe we don't think about as often or that might even be inappropriate's the wrong word, but that might be unnecessarily tying or triggering food.
Yeah.
Okay. So, here's sort of the umbrella. The categories that my brain put these into. I have food itself, people, places, times, activities, our senses, and then the big one, emotions. So we'll tackle each one of these and going through sort of identifying and some suggestions for adjusting them if we need to. So let's talk about food itself, right? And I mean, we talk about this all the time because we know food triggers pleasure and reward centers in the brain. We know excess sugar impacts our brain function, right? It can act like a drug and be addictive, right? Highly processed foods, grain products, right? Can our body cannot self-regulate processed food.
Right.
So a lot of times even the foods we're eating can trigger us to keep eating.
Exactly. Which I think is a
Um
hard thing for people to understand. Majority of people, right? Until they really get it.
right. So this was really interesting and I'm going to read to you guys like directly from this study. So a 2013 study concluded uh the consumption of a high compared with a low glycemic impact test meal increased the activity in brain regions related to food intake, reward, and cravings in the late postprandial period, which was coincident with lower blood glucose and greater hunger. The neurophysiological findings, together with longer feeding studies of weight loss maintenance, suggest that a reduced consumption of high glycemic impact carbohydrates, specifically highly processed grain products, potatoes, and concentrated sugar, may ameliorate overeating and facilitate maintenance of a healthy weight in individuals with overweight and obesity. I mean, it's not news. We know this. And then there are also some studies on brain activity that provide evidence supporting that overeating alters our brain's reward systems. And that even further drives the overeating. It's sort of like this conundrum, if you will.
Right. Yeah.
And we talked about this on the episode Food and Mood, right? That there's this chemical reaction in the brain to foods that we eat. And that explains why these foods trigger us to keep eating. So when we look at shifting the foods trigger, a lot of times we're looking for it to be willpower, right? Like we're trying to hang on by our fingertips to not eat whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so if we start our day with quality nutrition, protein and fiber, and some quality fat, it makes everything easier.
Absolutely. What a difference once you change your eating to that.
Yeah. And so if you're feeling like once you start, you can't stop, let's look at what it is that we're eating. And some of that might take care of itself. Like you don't have to white knuckle it over your brain chemistry.
Right. And then feel guilty and like you failed. Right. Those are
Exactly. Which then just exacerbates, right? Because then
absolutely
we get into feelings and emotions, which we'll talk about later, as triggers too.
right.
So there are also some supplements that you and I sometimes work with people too that can help with some of this food as a trigger or this once we start eating, we can't stop. But big things are chromium, an ingredient called lepticor, white kidney bean extract, some of these foods that can help our body, or nutrients, I suppose, that can help our body properly respond to leptin and ghrelin, the hormones that tell us when we're hungry and when we're satisfied. And choosing foods that have nutrition, choosing foods for nutrition, can help with the food as a trigger itself.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Absolutely.
All right, let's go to people as a trigger.
Oh, boy.
And yeah. So I think family is a big one in this, right? Like we have old habits when we're around family. I think, if it's certain friends who always eat a lot or the activity with certain people is always eating, um, maybe there are people whose eating habits impact your own eating habits. So for example, I have a client, um, she's 16 or 17 and her dad is very strict during the week and, sort of does whatever he wants on the weekends. And she was having a challenge the other night and he wanted somebody to heat up his pizza. And she lost it,
Wow. Right.
right? Like it was really hard for her. And she was certainly really frustrated, like rightfully
Right.
so.
Sure.
I mean, maybe less so now, but coworkers,
Yep. That.
or maybe certain people who just, their voice grates on your bones or whatever when you're, in a mood.
Right. Exactly. I have a client who wants to she wants to entertain. She loves entertaining. And so just this week she was talking about how she wants to have certain people over. I said, "Great, that sounds
Mhm.
terrific. So what food are you putting out?" And it was all cheeses and crackers. And I said, "But you know what makes you feel good and you know what to eat." She's like, "But they won't eat it." So that's another piece. Like she wants to please them, so she's not going to put out anything that she would normally eat now.
Well, so here's what's really interesting though, because I think our tendency is to think that everybody else wants the junk too.
True. I agree.
I feel like we don't give people enough credit for also wanting quality
I
choices.
agree. Right. And chances are they might be happy if she puts out some great stuff, you know?
Yeah. Let's be clear, nobody wants food that
Right.
tastes bad.
They want flavor.
But if it's
Right.
right, but if it's nutritious quality food, and that's balanced with more indulgent choices or some of the things that they only eat on occasion, that makes for a great dinner party.
Absolutely. That'd be great.
I mean, salad with fries, people. Right.
There's your balance.
Right. So there's one piece of it, right? Like choosing the foods that please you and please the other people. And recognizing and maybe giving others a little bit more credit than we sometimes do in this moment because our perception is that they want all these super indulgent
Right.
choices. Um and I think there's also something to be said for um whether it's coworkers or just anybody, right? If we know that there's the possibility of them to trigger, like have a plan, know what we're going to do, and maybe you start to suggest plans that include some kind of activity or even just choosing to hang out in a different location. So, for example, like at work with coworkers, right? Taking a break is often, at least when I was in an office, right? I always remember taking a break was hanging out in like the kitchen or the pantry and seeing who else was in there.
Right.
Or if you stayed in there for a few minutes, somebody else would end up in there to
Right.
talk to.
Yeah. Every day, 3 o'clock.
Yeah. So maybe it's a function of just going out to the parking lot.
Right.
Go for a walk. Although for us it's the street, but go go out and take a walk or something instead of surrounding ourselves with the people, and we'll come to places in a second, but um there's something to be said for the activities that we choose. I also think choosing who we share this with impacts how other people trigger us.
Hmm.
So if I remember feeling like if somebody else knew what I was doing and they were watching my plate, I was more triggered than if I was just left in my own little bubble to choose the food on my plate and other people didn't need to like draw extra attention
Right.
to it,
Right.
you know?
Comments and
And yeah, we talked about this a little bit in the episode, how to be a wellness ally. So there's certainly more in there. Um, but I also think, just saying like having just a couple people we share this with, and for everybody else, it's just who we are and what we do,
right.
you know? Um, and as far as like plans for social situations, we talk about it all the time around Thanksgiving. So there's a few Thanksgiving episodes that we have. Um, we could also do something on sort of like weddings or events when those things are coming up more often again. Now it's still sort of weird. Another thing that you might choose to do for people who trigger us is write a note to that person saying all the things that are in your head. Like, we're not going to send it. We're not going to give it to them, right? I don't even care if you burn it or shred it or throw it out after, but getting the stuff out,
Right.
say the things,
Yeah, because once it's out there,
write the expletives.
exactly. Once it's out there, you feel so much better. And even though it might sound silly to
Hmm.
some, it works.
Right. And I would say for a lot of these things, like play with it,
Right.
experiment, see how it feels. And by the way, something that works today may not work tomorrow. There's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with the tool. It's just a function of
Life. Hmm.
we're human. Yeah, life. All right. So that gives us food and people as triggers. Let's talk about places. And I started to talk about this like taking a break, but I think it's actually really interesting. And that goes beyond just a break in the office that happens in the kitchen or the pantry. But I think like even sitting at our desk, like we can justify taking a break from work to eat more than we can justify taking a break to walk around, to do nothing because we just need a break,
Right.
to lay down for 10 minutes.
Yeah, which is an interesting thing. Like, why do we do that, right? Because all of it is good for us.
Yeah,
but we'll take that break to eat something maybe not so good for us.
right,
Hmm.
right. So, one of the other things to do is, maybe the next time you listen to this, grab a piece of paper, pause this for a second, and make a list of locations of eating, right? Or locations that you associate with eating. So, some that may, like, here's a few to sort of get your brain going and then add your own, right? So, the kitchen, table, counter, refrigerator, dining room. What about your bedroom, a reading chair, the basement, the laundry room, maybe a game room or a recreation room? In your living room, is there a particular seat? Is it, the couch or, oh, that one chair? Is it, um, at a bar, or is there a particular game table that whenever you're sitting there, you're eating? Your office or a study, places in your house, right? Or outdoor, is it like the backyard or sitting on the patio, the front porch like you and I do at your house?
That's right.
um the bathroom could be a place for some people. If it is, cool. You do you.
Right,
Um
no judgment.
right. Uh and then in the bedroom, right, which I mentioned bedroom before, but is it the bed? Is it a chair in the bedroom? Then there's also, right, we talked about sort of your desk or computer station. What else, what other locations do you associate with eating? Where if you were in that location and you weren't eating, it would be weird,
Right. Hmm. Yeah, it is interesting.
right? It's interesting.
Right.
Like restaurants.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the places when I eat. Do I eat healthier when I sit at certain places? Do I crave something when I'm sitting somewhere
Mhm.
else? So that is a very interesting thing to think about.
Or even going back to that dinner party, are there certain people's houses where going there for dinner means,
Right.
you know, excess? So think about that, make a list. And then, depending on what's on your list, we want to think about some solutions or options for that location. So, like we talked about work, maybe instead of a break in the pantry, it's a break on the street, or in the parking lot.
Right.
Um, Maybe you want to keep, like, remember those stress balls, like the things that you squeeze? Maybe you want to keep that at your desk.
It's a great idea.
And then that helps sort of, you know, get the frustration out. You could even, um, in the car, maybe you keep water there. Maybe keep some nuts in the car so that at least like the first step is a healthier option to eating. Because I do think that the expectation that we're going to go from one extreme to the other is a bit misguided and setting ourselves up,
I agree. Hmm.
right? So if the first piece is here's another option, if I eat in the car, I'm going to have, an apple, some nuts, or things that are quality choices. Maybe if it's in the car or a place that you pass, right? Maybe drive a different route to avoid those usual stops, right? It's a physical change of the pattern.
Yeah, those are great.
Think about, maybe listen to something. like a podcast, wink, wink. But maybe maybe listen to something in the car that keeps your mind occupied elsewhere,
Right, then you're not thinking about it.
or if you're used to listening. What was that?
Then you're not thinking about it.
Right, or if you're used to listening to one thing, change it up so that you're listening to something else and it's really catching your attention. I remember years ago, I remember specifically, like, it was sort of one of those manic moments, and I stopped in somewhere, I bought something, and I was literally walking down the street in New York, like, chowing on something, like, I couldn't get it in me fast enough, and I remember just saying, "I will no longer eat in transit."
Right,
Like, I'm not doing that anymore. That's certainly harder sometimes, right? Like, that was only on occasion for me, so it wasn't that big of a deal, but we can sort of have intermediate steps to get from here to there.
right.
Um, for restaurants specifically, like the menu mayhem episode, we went through all these menus so that you have plenty of options. Um, and I think a big thing is like just one time, like that drive, like driving a different route, just one time, do it differently. Do a different activity in that location. So like if a place for you is sitting on the couch, right? I have a coloring book that sits under my coffee table. So at least there's something else there. And then I talk about it all the time. Write a post-it. Write a list of these ideas on a post-it so that in the moment you don't have to think of them, right?
That's a good idea.
And then we put this
Mhm.
post-it on the coffee table, on the pint of ice cream, on our computer screen, so that it reminds us of our options. Because I think also the expectation that we're going to have this like skies parting moment of clarity when we're in the throes of a situation is also setting ourselves up.
Absolutely, and I think by writing that, it takes the really planning ahead out. So in that moment when you're feeling that and you write it all down,
Yep.
then it's not such a burden or an event later,
Exactly.
right? When it's just there.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's great.
Moving on to the next trigger, times of day. Are you the person who's like, oh, it's midday, must be lunchtime, right? Or like you said before, 3 p.m. means break time, need a
That's right.
snack,
It
right?
means, right, not so good food and some coffee, right?
Yeah. And I will say, like, if you're sort of in the beginning of your um, transition to a lower glycemic impact way of eating, or even to eating regularly to keep your blood sugar levels even, there is a piece of this where maybe eating by the clock is helpful and the clock can be a great reminder. But that I think also is for a period of time. And as we progress, we want to realize that not every day is the same,
Right.
you know?
I look at the clock as guidance. So when I'm talking to my clients, it's more of guidance, but I want you to eat between that breakfast time, whatever that would be for you, and your lunch time and then dinner time.
Mhm.
Right. So I look at it for them specifically for guidance so that they can kind of keep a good gauge if it's all new to them. Once they have it, then they don't need it as much, the guidance.
Yeah, and I think of it like, noting what time we eat something helps us gauge if the next time we're hungry is an appropriate time to be hungry. So, for example, if we had the equivalent of a snack at breakfast and then we're irritated that we're hungry at 10:30 or 11 a.m., it
Right.
actually makes perfect sense that you'd be hungry at 10:30 or 11 if you ate breakfast at, 8 or 9, but it was only a snack size amount of food.
Right.
So I do like the clock in those ways, but if you find yourself sort of like eating because the clock says something consistently, right? Like that 3 o'clock snack or that 3 o'clock break. Go back to the Post-it note, right? Write some things on there. So if we need a break, maybe read a book, make a shopping list, um, go for, a short walk, do a breathing exercise, stretch your body,
Right,
do a couple of stretches. Um, I do think eating breakfast, ideally within an hour of waking up, getting something in your system within an hour of waking up helps dramatically with every single thing we're talking about because it sets the stage for our blood sugar for the entire day.
right.
Um, if after meals is a challenging, right? So after a meal, every time you're done, you sort of have that craving for something sweet, maybe. Right? So going back to that idea of like disrupt. So we're done eating, get up from the table, right? Clear the plate. Potentially brush your teeth after the meal. So not only does the mint neutralize our taste buds, but there's also sort of that like Pavlovian response to I brush my teeth, I'm done eating.
Yeah, it's a great one.
I'm a big fan of walking after meals. Even if it's 10 minutes, so maybe it's a function of saying, okay, I'm actually going to put the shoes, somewhere in the kitchen so that it's a physical reminder or near the dining table. So it's a physical reminder to get up after we're done. You could also, if you're in a place to do this, right, ask yourself, do I need to eat more right now? If the answer is yes, do I need it that instant? Maybe ask yourself why, right? And I also think what you're looking for is a big thing. If the only thing that sounds good is chocolate, you're probably not really hungry, right? In which case, we could then ask ourselves, is this because it's a habit, right? Because I'm used to finishing a meal with something sweet. Or we could say, and this is a big one, where am I not being fed?
Right. You know what? Last year you said that to me because
Mhm.
I remember eating breakfast and then I asked you about some kind of bar. And that was your question. Why do you need to eat again? Like what do you need? What's going on? And ever
Mhm.
since that day, I think about it almost every single day after breakfast. And it's funny because yes, I want sweets. I'm a sweet person. So, my go-to sweet now is like an RX bar, because those work for
Right.
me. So I'm like, okay, it's better. But you're right. It became a habit. And I think that's the thing I needed to break. You know, it was strictly
But
a
like you
habit.
just said, it's such a process, right? So
Right.
you shifted from what you were eating to the RX bar,
Right. Right. I
and then
feel better
eventually you get to yeah, and then
about it. Right.
eventually get to the point where you're like, "You know what? I'm gonna see what happens if I don't have that."
Exactly.
But I'm curious, like, if you tried to go from what you were choosing before, what was your sweet thing before? Forgive me, I
Oh,
don't remember.
no, I used to be a big chocolate person. So
Okay.
it didn't matter what, as long as it's dark chocolate.
So if we had said we're gonna go from dark chocolate to where you are right now, a
Hmm.
year plus later.
Oh, boy, yeah. Mm-mm. I couldn't have imagined that, you know? Like, there's no way I could have imagined that. And then once I replaced it with something else that was better, started changing the actual habit of going and grabbing that something else, it was so apparent that it was just a habit. It's not that I'm hungry, you know? And of course, I mean, what I know is that if I am craving it, like legitimately craving it, I didn't have enough to eat already. So,
Mhm.
it's a very big mindset thing. And it takes time to get there. So,
Yeah.
it can be discouraging because of that whole, we put a lot on willpower. So,
Yeah. So, this next category, sort of similar to the places thing, where we want to make that inventory list, right? Where we had places that we associate with food.
mhm,
We're now going to talk about activities that we associate with food. The number one to me is going to the movies.
right,
For some people, watching TV at home, or if the activity is relaxing at the end of the day, that includes food.
right,
Um, for some people, working requires a snack next to them. Um, maybe it's playing a game. Or if playing cards is an activity that you do and there are always snacks there, absolutely. Or like that dinner party we talked about. Um, like for me, like reading, for some reason, like if I think that I'm gonna like sit down to read, it requires something to drink.
right.
I don't know why. Right? Um, Also food prep. Like maybe you associate food prep with snacking along the way.
Right.
So make a note, some of the ones that we talked about. Maybe there are others for you. And this is the same thing as what we've talked about with all of the others is first of all, the awareness that this activity has a food component. Shifting what that food component is the first thing. And eventually then saying, do I actually need food to be part of this activity? Like for me, sometimes, like if I'm feeling a little unmotivated to work or I need to do something, like I can make myself a cup of tea, in particular, like well-being tea. I get my tea, my water, and I sit down and I'm like, okay, I can do this. Right. But at least that's what I'm choosing compared to some things that I've chosen in the past.
Right.
Right. Which might be cookies or chips or who knows what.
Right.
So then the last category that I have for this moment of triggers are our senses. And this is another one where it's just a function of noticing, right? Do we see food and want to eat it? Do we smell it and want to eat it? Do we think about it and want to eat it? Right? And just noticing what those things are for us. And if even the thought of food creates a very intense need to eat, then we want to strategize, when are we thinking about it? When are we planning that next meal? At that time, perhaps the time to plan the day's food is at dinner or right after dinner the night before, plan the next day. Or at breakfast, you're writing it out what lunch is going to be. And then if the thought comes up about lunch, you already know, and onward. Right? So we can create the tools that fit.
Great idea.
Overarching, right? To recap sort of these cues. First piece is awareness, right? Something goes from an unconscious to a conscious habit or behavior. Then we break the cycle. So we do something different. We drive the different route. We set an alarm to take a break at a different time of day. We eat at home before going to the movies, right? Or maybe even you're saying to someone, can we do this later? Can we have this conversation later?
Right.
Right? We're breaking the cycle. Then we substitute, like we said, right? We're going to replace it with something new. So if you, let me try English, your Post-its, right? You have just a different food choice. Maybe bring your own popcorn to the movie as the first step to shift what your habits are at the movies, right? Eat before you go, bring your own popcorn.
Right.
And then the last piece is reintroduce. Small, measured exposures. And this is, I think, really important and something that not enough people talk about. And it comes up a lot with phobias and fears, or um, even with pain patients. We do it a lot, small measured exposures to the trigger. And what it allows us to do is not have to live the rest of our life in avoidance. Because I think, especially when it comes to weight or food, people's plan is, I'm just not going to keep that food in my house.
Right. Yeah, that's what I think a lot of people do.
And that can work for a period of time. But the idea that we're maybe never going to live with somebody who wants that food in the house, or we're never going to have a particular activity ever again in our lives, is really inappropriate, in a way of saying long term health, balanced approach, a quality conversation that you're having in your own head about this stuff. We want to be able to get to a place where we can have anything in our house and it's okay.
Right. Definitely. I mean, that's the ideal, right? If you can look at it, you don't need it, you're fine with it being there. That's a hard piece to get to,
Mhm.
but you can get to it.
And it's okay. Like, we don't have to get there
Right. Exactly.
tomorrow. That can take time, but we want to make sure that our long term plan is not
Right.
avoidance. Okay. That was a lot. And what's coming up next is the big one, and it sort of underlies everything else. So let's take a deep breath while we share a message from our partner for this episode, Lumiere de Vie. Lumiere de Vie Skincare was founded by Amber Ridinger McLaughlin in response to her own experience of mere marginal results from countless costly creams. She realized the revitalization of her youthful skin could only occur if she developed products herself. Working closely with beauty scientists and exploring the most advanced ingredients derived from the earth and sea, Amber created Lumiere de Vie, the next generation of skincare. The extensive line of luxury skincare products is designed to address all skin types and concerns with the highest quality natural ingredients and powerful formulas that help heal, soothe, moisturize, and protect. Lumiere de Vie acts as first aid for your skin. The result? Rejuvenated, luminous, beautiful looking skin. And I'm not going to lie, you guys, like, washing my face is a physical step that helps me move on and take care of me, and it's why I love Lumiere. Like, it's literally like going to the spa for a facial every morning and every night when I wash my face. To get started, I highly recommend the skincare value kit because it gives you cleanser, toner, moisturizer. Those are the fundamentals of any skincare regimen. So it gives you those three for $125. And then, depending on your particular concerns or needs, you could add in any serums or specialty treatments or things like that. Start with the foundation, the skincare value kit, 125. And because you're a Salad with a Side of Fries listener, you get 10% off plus free shipping. What a deal. So to get this, text the word skin, SKIN, to 844-947-4846. You'll receive the link and coupon code right to your phone. Again, simply text the word skin, SKIN, to 844-947-4846 to try Lumiere de Vie Skincare, get 10% off and free shipping. This is a toll-free number. Standard text and data rates may apply. Okay, Darlene, this is a big one.
Can't wait.
It's like, I think when I said this before, I was like, oof.
Right. Exactly.
Right. Let's just all take a collective deep breath, prepare ourselves, because emotions triggering us to eat is often not actually the emotion. It's the desire to not feel the emotion.
Yes, exactly.
And the trick to this, and I'm going to make a few book recommendations, but I'm going to go through what those books recommend, sort of, so that we have context for this conversation. But I think essentially, we eat to numb to avoid feeling the feelings. And the truth is, what we have to do is identify and feel, and then the need for the numbing diminishes. And that seems really counterproductive because we think if we feel these things, then we're going to want to eat even more.
Right.
But it's not actually what's happening. And I think eating to numb often also leads to beating ourselves up, which is then yet another emotion, right? But I think beating ourselves up is an acceptable emotion or something that we know and we can manage. We think we can manage that.
Right. And we don't need to be doing that. Right. It's it's a vicious
Exactly.
cycle, the whole thing. All the emotions with food.
Yeah. And like, again, I also want to say, like, of course, this is where we ended up. To expect that we would end up somewhere else would actually have required a completely different education and upbringing. So we need to let ourselves off the hook and learn a different tool now,
Right.
right? That's the point. So a lot of this, what I'm about to talk about, comes from Dr. Mark Brackett. He has a book called Permission to Feel, and it's all about social emotional learning and emotional literacy. And his book really talks about, and a lot of his implementation is about schools to give kids social emotional intelligence and to teach this because essentially what he says is that feelings, social emotional learning, emotional literacy is complex. And so it makes sense that we numb, right? Like, how often does someone say, "How are you?" or "How are you feeling?" And like, Darlene, what's your response?
I'm good.
Yeah, fine,
Right.
good. But we say that even when we're not,
Right.
right? Because people don't really want to know the answer. Or like,
Right.
how many times have you said it, but we don't really want to know,
Right.
right?
Like,
Because
please
we
don't
don't,
answer. Right.
right? Like, just say good, just
Mm-hmm.
say fine, right?
Yep.
Because we're busy and we don't want to have to stop doing our stuff to deal with someone else's stuff.
Right.
And that's especially the case with kids. But I don't have kids. So, all I can say is definitely read this book, Permission to Feel by Dr. Mark Brackett. But so what he really talks about is how we don't, the average American, right? We don't have the lexicon for emotions. Like, we don't have a broad enough vocabulary to express our emotions appropriately. Like, he calls it training in emotion recognition, right? And so that's why I'm sending our members the feelings inventory and the needs inventory so that we can start to expand our vocabulary and really identify what it is that's going on. Do we have needs that aren't being met? What is it that we're actually feeling? And then the other piece of this that's kind of hard is that we have to, or we want to learn to separate mood from emotions. Okay, so moods tend to be longer lasting, not targeted. So, like a weather pattern. This is how Christine and I were talking about it the other day. It's like a weather pattern coming and going. Emotions are the wind or the storm, right? The thunder and lightning. Maybe you're hearing the wind of my window right now, right? Right? Depression might be the season versus the emotion in a moment might be um you know angry, frustrated, shame, disappointment, right? So there's sort of the mood that's like the umbrella, and then underneath that, what's creating that mood. right? What are the things we actually feel in our body? Like feelings are called feelings because they're physical in the body. And then similar to this idea of mood versus emotions, there's also thoughts versus feelings.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Feelings or emotions are much more granular, they're much more specific. I feel like approaching or I feel like avoiding are actually thoughts.
Right.
The feeling underneath that, right, might be different. So Mark says, anger is about injustice. Disappointment is about unmet expectations. Anxiety is about uncertainty. And the language of emotion is what he thinks we really need to get at in order to help ourselves thrive and figure this stuff out. So when you're in those moments, if you're having, if you're feeling like you're stuck in the emotion, right? One of the things you can say to yourself is, I'm having the thought that blank. I'm having the thought that there's a lot of anxiety right now. I'm having the thought that things are really uncertain. And while that might be the feeling, shifting the feeling into a thought gives us a little bit of distance to be able to see what's going on. You can also tell yourself a story about it, right? So we can dramatize it a little bit or walk ourselves through this story and kind of explore what's happening. So before I get into some of the other tools that Mark talks about, like he has a framework called Ruler that I'm going to walk through really quick. I feel like I've done a lot of talking. Darlene, where are you at?
So I love what you were saying because I've adapted some of those tools throughout my life. So I used to have great anxiety in my 20s, which is 20 something years ago, everybody. So it took me a long time to get to the point where I could separate the feeling and the thought. So now,
Mhm.
if that comes on, because I am being triggered, right? And I'm not necessarily being fully aware in the moment, but all of a sudden I can feel stuff. I have to stop and I have to think it through and I talk it through to myself. Like, okay, you're anxious. Why? What just happened? Okay, you don't know what just happened. Did something happen yesterday? Did something happen the day before? How long have you been feeling this? So I really talk myself through it now. And that tool is so helpful because in time you get to that quicker, right? And
Yeah.
you can kind of just let it go quicker or make a
Yep.
step toward making it different, whatever the situation is, right? If you can
Right.
recognize it. So I think that's a really
And
important
and
tool.
that might happen. I love what you just said because that whole thing might happen while you're eating the ice cream.
Right, exactly.
And that's
It's
okay.
okay if you're eating it and it happens, as long as
Right.
you recognized it, right? You got to that point. Like that's something to, be happy about. You got to that point where you could recognize it, even if you started eating that ice cream already, because
Yeah.
eventually you might get there before you start eating that ice cream.
Exactly. Exactly. So, I wanna go through Mark's framework that he calls Ruler, right? Ruler is an acronym. So, the first R is recognizing. The hard part of this is that it requires us to pause for a second to recognize what's occurring for ourselves or for the other person, right? And we can misread it. So, the first step is recognizing. The second piece, the U, is understanding. And this is where it gets a little cognitive because we might recognize something as anger. So, for example, in other people, like he tells the story of like a little kid who his dad always seems angry, right? His dad comes home from work and he's really angry. But as we start to sort of think about it, the underlying about like the underlying themes or the underlying emotions or feelings, the causes and consequences of the feeling. So the cause and consequences of the anger, maybe there was something that happened at work and he's feeling shame and it's manifesting like what we're able to read is anger.
Right.
So thinking to intellectualize a little bit what's underlying, right? If anger is the mood, what's the feeling underneath that? So Mark says disappointment versus anger, right? Disappointment is unmet expectations. Anger is perceived injustice. Jealousy is the feeling that you're threatened by something or someone you care about. It, or maybe, someone's going to be taken away from you. Envy is about wanting what someone else wants. Fear is impending danger. So if we can sort of identify what's happening, right, and use the inventories that I'm going to send to our members, right, so that you have more words for this stuff, it can help us, recognize and understand. The L is the next piece where we want all those words, and that's labeling, right? So using an appropriate label or an appropriate word. And we can get really nuanced in that too, even to say, okay, it's fear, but how much fear? Because a lot of fear versus a little bit of fear can get a different response. And how much also impacts the E, which is expression. So, one piece of expression is permission to express the feelings. And the other side is recognizing that a lot of something or a little bit of something is going to impact what it looks like, how it comes out. And this is where we don't necessarily always have permission to express the feelings. So that's why we might need to write the note to that person, get it out of our system,
Right.
express it, have a good cry, do what you got to do.
Nothing wrong crying.
And then, right? Yeah. And then the last R of ruler is regulating. And this is where we need the strategies, right? To say, okay, how do I prevent this feeling? How do I reduce this feeling? Do I create it? Do I just want to maintain it? Do I want to enhance it if it's a positive feeling? Right? And what are the strategies that we have to do that? There's a lot more to this. I highly recommend the book. Permission to Feel by Dr. Mark Brackett.
Yeah, he gives some great examples.
And then, yeah. And then there's another book that I think is really fascinating and plays into this. And the book is technically on burnout. It's by Emily and Amelia Nagoski. And they're twins. So they wrote this book and they talk a lot because the topic is burnout, it's all about stress. But it actually applies to all of our emotions, right? So they talk about emotions as, right, with feelings, right? It's physical in our system. And even if we mentally move on, if our physical body has not moved through the entire span of that state, of that emotion, it gets stuck and it manifests somewhere in the body. So they use the metaphor of like a tunnel. If we don't go all the way through the tunnel and we get stuck in the middle, for example, of a stress response, it manifests in the body. And we can have all sorts of symptoms that we don't understand. And by the way, if we feel like we're just always eating, it's likely that we are stuck in the middle of some sort of emotion.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So they go through a handful of things that we actually talk about all the time for how to complete a cycle, how to complete an emotional cycle. So physical movement makes sense, right? So I was actually having a conversation with a colleague yesterday, and he was talking about how he's having this like pervasive anxiety. And I said, so we were talking through these, and I said, by the way, you always exercise in the morning. What if you just added some sort of physical activity to later in the day to help get the stress out of your body? It's a physical release. The second one is breathing. We've talked about breathing a million times, but like caveman days, like you're running from the tiger, slowing down the breathing is a chemical signal to the body that the stressor is past, right? We're turning off the sympathetic, we're turning on the parasympathetic nervous system to rest and digest, to move through that cycle, right? Another interesting one is positive social interaction. And talk about times when this is hard. I mean, hello, we're in the middle of a pandemic where everybody's saying, stay alone, isolate,
Right.
right? Find intentional, positive social interaction. And the interesting thing that they talk about is that it doesn't even have to be somebody you know really well. Like, if you're walking into Starbucks, and in the city, this happens a lot, but there might be somebody, who doesn't have home or shelter, and they're at the door opening and closing the door for people. Buy that person a coffee or a bagel. That's enough. Or you don't even have to spend money. Say to the person, compliment somebody you're standing in line next to or the barista. But what it does is that if we're able to identify something in somebody else and compliment it, right, or have these other conversations, it signals to the body that we're no longer in panic mode. Because if we're in fight or flight or we're trying to survive, those aren't things that happen, right? Those are things that happen when we're in a relaxed state.
Right.
So we can sort of reverse engineer that.
I think that's an easier one and a great thing, right?
Yeah.
Because I feel like even in general terms, if we're not going so deep, once we treat somebody
Hmm.
else great, it changes your whole outlook
Hmm.
of whatever's going on right in that moment, right? So it's so
Yep.
important if we can try to do that more often.
And think about too, like you're less likely to, like if you're in a state, whatever it is, and you're like blinders on, mumbling under your breath, frustrated, whatever it is, you don't even notice the guy who's opened the
Right,
door. Or we like say something angry and bitter about the guy who's opening the door, right? If we're able to do something positive in that way,
right.
it completely shifts everything.
Yeah, that intentional piece is very important.
Mhm. So another one that I like a lot that they talk about is laughter. But, like, it can't be, like, fake trying to make myself laugh, and it can't be, like, a light chuckle. It has to be, like, real, guttural, like, lying, abs hurt laughter. Lying. I meant crying, abs hurt laughter,
Yeah,
right? Another one is affection. And again, it's interesting because affection's really hard when we're in a heightened emotional state, or we look to the food for that affection that we're missing. So the research, according to the book and Emily and Amelia, the research suggests a 20-second hug can change your hormones, lower your blood pressure and your heart rate, and improve your mood.
hmm, that's interesting.
Mhm. So a 20-second hug is potentially a very uncomfortably long hug. Right? So just choose who that's happening with. Have that person, you know? Um, Similar here, they talk about crying, right? That physical expression of whatever the emotion is. And then the last one they talk about is creative expression. And I love this. Like, what's creative for you? Like, did you used to draw as a kid and you haven't drawn anything in years? Like, it's why I like the coloring books, like, and I didn't even put that together until this. They even talk about somebody knitting, like, knitting could be enough. Or the other interesting thing about creative expression is tapping into imagination. So if you have kids, like, go make up a story with your kids, go do an art project. Figure out what it is for you, and that's where it's experimenting. Like, which of these works on any given day might be different.
Yeah, those are great.
Okay, so here's the other thing to this, right? We talked about their big thing is that we have to complete this emotional cycle. And I'm just going to quote them in this. And it's, don't worry if you're not sure you can recognize when you've completed the cycle, especially if you've been or if you've spent a lot of years, like your whole life, holding on to worry or anger. You've probably got a whole lot of accumulated stress response cycles spinning their engines, waiting for their turn. So it's going to take a while before you get through the backlog. All you need to do is recognize that you feel incrementally better than you felt before you started. And you can notice that something in your body has changed or shifted in the direction of peace. If it was an 8 on the stress scale when I started and now I'm a 4, you can look at yourself and say, that's pretty good. So incremental progress is progress. And the other thing they talk about is you don't have to finish the cycle in the moment. You can come back to it later, right? So if we're at work and it is not an appropriate time to like punch a pillow, we can actually go home and punch the pillow later, thinking about the thing and complete that cycle. It's okay. So their book is called Burnout. And then there's another one, if you're interested, that they like too. It's called In an Unspoken Voice by Peter Levine. And he's about somatic experiencing. So physically experiencing a lot of this stuff. Okay, we went through a lot. Darlene.
We did.
How are you feeling about all this? What's sitting with you?
Gosh, I mean, we did go through a lot. So I think all of it is great. Now, I don't, people can't get overwhelmed. So, like you said in the beginning, like take a piece of
Yes.
it that resonated and, try to put it into action when you're feeling certain things. Like I said to you just now, that, when I can recognize now quickly when I'm getting anxious and kind of backtrack and then change it.
Yeah.
And before I would have gone for food, where now it's like, no, just sit there with yourself for a second and let's think this through before we do anything.
Mm-hmm.
So that piece is a big deal for me because that's what works for me.
Yeah.
But different things work for different people. So, whatever one of these, maybe there are a couple to work on, that might come easier for you. I would definitely work on those.
Yeah. I think the thing to remember, in addition to everything you just said, is like,
We're human.
we're human. We're not going to go from one extreme to the other. It is appropriate
Right.
to be triggered.
Right.
It's about what we do with that and how we manage that for ourselves that we're looking for. And the idea of turning to food is simply a maladaptive behavior that we've developed. We learned it. We can unlearn it. We can learn something
Right.
new and replace it. And that's really
Right.
effing
And
exciting.
small steps, like they were just saying in that book that
Yes.
don't get upset if you don't finish the cycle. Like it takes time to get
Right.
to a solution, right? Like we were saying, even if you're in the middle of eating that
Exactly.
ice cream, but you recognized it, good for you. Like be happy and be proud about that because
Right.
it takes time. And eventually you'll get there and you'll stop it before.
Exactly. Stay in touch. Let us know how you're doing. Like, what did you notice? What's resonating with you? And like I said, you might have to listen to this a couple times, and that is totally okay. You maybe even had to pause it in the middle, and you're now hearing this, and it's your second or third or fourth attempt at getting through it. Kudos to you because you did it.
Right.
Excellent. It's time for our nutrition nugget. You ready?
I'm ready.
All right. This week, we're talking about gluten. It's been a long time coming. We've talked about it in the context of other specialty food plans, even with fads, but I wanted to do a dedicated couple minutes. First, everybody has to understand what gluten actually is. So, gluten is the protein found in some grains. The big ones are wheat, barley, and rye. So, gluten, this protein, acts like glue and helps hold the food together or helps maintain the shape of foods. The next piece to wrap our heads around is sensitivity and celiac versus allergy. Okay. So, it's almost like reactions on a spectrum to the same ingredient. Okay. So, allergy is a response in the immune system. And the onset of symptoms tends to be shortly after eating the gluten. It takes less of the ingredient to ignite a response. And I've heard actually if you have allergy or even celiac that, like, the white part of your nail by your nail bed, that's the amount that it might take to elicit a response,
Wow.
right? And then that is compared to an intolerance, which is when you have trouble digesting the food. And this is actually similar to like a sensitivity, which can be a reaction in the white blood cells, right? So, like, there's also the spectrum of intolerance, sensitivity, and celiac. So, on the intolerance and sensitivity side, it might take more gluten to have symptoms, and it could take up to 72 hours to experience those symptoms. Severe intolerance, right, or the most severe gluten intolerance is celiac disease, which is actually an autoimmune condition. So I believe the current statistic is about 1 in 100 Americans have diagnosed celiac disease. If undiagnosed, it can lead to gastrointestinal problems, reproductive issues, anemia, osteoporosis, malnutrition, weight loss, poor brain function, exhaustion. And it can be hard to recover from these long-term symptoms if it goes undiagnosed for long periods of time. So, I just want to reiterate, celiac is an autoimmune condition, and it's sort of at the extreme end of a gluten sensitivity. The two terms we don't really want to use interchangeably, and people often do. So I think it's just important that we're drawing that distinction. And then allergies also, by the way, allergies can range too. Um, you know, allergies also will always trigger a reaction. Intolerance will only trigger a reaction if there's enough consumed, right? So we can draw another distinction there. And I know I keep saying reaction or symptoms. So, like, what does that look like? And the challenge here is that symptoms of an intolerance are similar to those of celiac disease. And again, it sort of ranges, right? So some people, not everybody experiences everything, and not everybody experiences everything to the same degree. But the most common symptoms are bloating, gas or abdominal pain, diarrhea or constipation, nausea, headache, brain fog, joint pain, numbness in the legs, arms, or fingers, and fatigue. So essentially, what's happening, like the bloating, gas, and abdominal pain, they're, I think, like the most common symptoms of gluten intolerance. And it's because our body can't break it down, right? It's wreaking havoc in our digestive system. And then as the body attempts to digest the proteins with tremendous difficulty, extra gases are released. And then as it goes through the rest of our system, we see issues with the rest of the digestive process too, right? The elimination piece. So, and like I said, it can be complicated because not everybody has all the symptoms. With allergies, it's again on a range for the severity of the allergy. So for some people, it might be like scratchiness, right? Or hives. For other people, it could be full blown anaphylaxis, right? It's like any other allergy where someone may have a minor reaction or someone may have a major reaction. The next piece to tackle is testing and diagnosis. Generally, for intolerances, there's no specific test to diagnose. With allergies, there are tests. Celiac can be diagnosed through tests that look at specific biomarkers. So those ones are going to look at, it's called tissue transglutaminase antibody. And then there's some other biomarkers that are designed to identify immunoglobulin deficiencies. Gluten sensitivity or intolerance is most often diagnosed through an elimination diet, which we've talked about many times. We want to remove any food that has gluten for 2 weeks. Take note of any symptoms that, feel relieved. Have one serving of something with gluten at one meal and then not again for 72 hours. And we're going to take note of anything we notice, right? Any of those symptoms. And then if we determine that we really do have a need to eliminate gluten or maintain a gluten-free diet, it really requires a greater commitment to your health, right? Because depending on the level of allergy, you may have to be careful with packaged foods to see if they're made in a facility that also processes or manufactures foods with gluten, right? Or like oats, for example. Oats do not contain gluten, but if they're processed in a facility that also processes wheat or barley, from the initial processing, like, or they're grown somewhere that also grows wheat or barley to, being in a plant somewhere that's also packaging even, grains, there could be cross contamination there. And then we want to think about foods that are derived from wheat, barley, rye. So, it's not just bread, it's like things that have malt, brewer's yeast, soy sauce, um, meat substitutes. A lot of times in those packaged foods, they're going to have grains or be derived from grains that contain gluten. Anything made with flour, we want to pay attention to. And then you may have to even go so far, depending on the extent of your allergy, you may have to look at cosmetic products that are used near your mouth, right? Oral care, um, supplements, Play-Doh, right? Depending on the sensitivity, we might need to make sure that we're identifying it in all areas. Now, here's the thing, because not all grains have gluten. So gluten-free products are often made with rice, oats, buckwheat, and corn. And some of these are not necessarily our healthiest options or really like our lowest glycemic options. So what that means is many gluten-free products will be made with rice or corn or oats and therefore higher glycemic, more likely to spike our blood sugar than the actual whole grain. So, simply choosing gluten-free foods does not mean that they are inherently healthier options. If you don't have a sensitivity, an intolerance, or an allergy, you may want to eat the variations of foods made from the actual whole grain. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention glyphosate in this conversation. Okay, so glyphosate, do you know what it is, Darlene? Are you
I
familiar with
don't.
this? Okay.
No.
Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup, which is the top weed killer used by farmers. And I've said this for a long time with a lot of things where we're seeing so many diagnoses that, when we were kids or our parents were kids, were not a thing. And I have to think that those things are connected, right? 2013, there's a study. And the title of the study was Glyphosate Pathways to Modern Diseases, Celiac Sprue and Gluten Intolerances. So, the study basically proposed that glyphosate is the most important causal factor in the epidemic of celiac disease. It then outlines all these imbalances in gut bacteria, vitamin deficiencies, amino acids, metals, and minerals in the body, all impacted the same way that glyphosate is known to impact, and the same things that glyphosate is known to impact. So I'm just going to read this excerpt from it. So it says, celiac disease patients have an increased risk to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which has also been implicated in glyphosate exposure. Reproductive issues associated with celiac disease, such as infertility, miscarriages, and birth defects, can also be explained by glyphosate. Glyphosate residues in wheat and other crops are likely increasing recently due to the growing practice of crop desiccation just prior to harvest. We argue that the practice of ripening sugarcane with glyphosate may explain the recent surge in kidney failure among agricultural workers in Central America. We conclude with a plea to governments to reconsider policies regarding the safety of glyphosate residues in foods.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
right? I'll get off my soapbox, but I just think there's way too much. It's not a coincidence. And what it takes for us to move away from glyphosate is, Roundup is just replacing ingredients right now, which also have implications. And so I'm going to find us an expert in this who can come talk to us more about it. But I had to include it in our conversation on gluten. Wrapping this up, gluten is the protein found in grains, specifically wheat, rye, and barley. You likely have to do an elimination diet to determine if you have any issues or you notice symptoms. And you may want to talk to your healthcare provider about specific additional testing. If you need to avoid gluten, you must be diligent because it's in foods that you wouldn't realize. And if you don't need to avoid gluten, gluten-free foods are not inherently better choices. All right. Anything I forgot on gluten,
I don't think
Darlene?
so. I think you covered it all.
Well, thank you again for being here. I know this was not an easy one. This was probably very confronting, all things
It
considered.
was great. Thank you for having me. Loved it, as usual.
Absolutely. Well, as always, everybody, I'm your host, Jenn Trepeck. Connect with me on Instagram or all social media. I'm at Jenn Trepeck, JENNTREPECK. Send me a DM or send a message through our website, A Salad with a Side of Fries. I want to hear your takeaways, your ideas, your questions. This is also the easiest way to learn more about working with me or with Darlene because we work together. I am also personally inviting you to level up your game by becoming a podcast member. Go to glow.fm/salad with a side of fries. Becoming a member shows your support for this podcast, this community, and above all, supports your health. You'll get this week's recipe, which is like 5-in-1 recipes for the roasted vegetable bowl, plus the feelings and needs inventories. So until next week, everybody, or maybe until you listen to this one again, find the strength, the courage, and the bravery to feel the feelings, identify your triggers, and potentially just take one step in the direction of your own growth. Well, friends, that's it for today's episode of Salad with a Side of Fries. Congratulations for making yourself and your health a priority. Thanks so much for joining us. Be sure to click subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast platform. Share us with a friend, and we'll be back next week. Always remember, you deserve it, and you are worth it. Happy healthy.